Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's lecture. And we are going to have a research discussion on what has been going on, the teaching and researching peace and conflict studies in African universities. And this is not an anthropological research or a sociological, it's an epistemic or epistemological critique. And this is important because over time there's been a debate what exactly being taught in the universities in relation to peace and conflict studies. And today we are going to deal with this matter. It is an outcome of a one-year research on a number of universities in the world, what particularly we are doing in terms of research and teaching in the area of peace and conflict. For purposes of this presentation, we are not going into specific universities. We are going to cover as continents. We are going to cover as groups of universities from different continents for purposes of this discussion, as I did say. So welcome to today's discussion. And as it were, it's teaching and researching peace and conflict studies in African universities, an epistemological critique. We want to situate the debate. We want to understand where this debate is coming from. And what we know is there's been a discussion from one African popular president in a statement 2014. He did argue that conflict and peace studies is not useful. That's quite dramatic. That's quite uncharitable in many ways, but it's also thinkable. And it's not the uncharitable part that we are looking at or being awful, but we are looking at the idea that is thinkable. So let's think together through this issue that conflict and peace studies is not useful. First, we want to go back genealogically to understand how peace and conflict studies started over time. But because we don't have the time to go through the entire episode, the entire genealogy, we are simply focusing on very particular periodizing to give us an aspect and a quick aspect to this. In Cold War and in the independence struggle, it was considered in USA and Europe, that is peace and conflict studies, as ideological. And here we can read Peter Wallenstein, 2002, page 17, and Gerald Steiner, 2007. The post-Cold War and post-colonial period, particularly in Africa and Asia, the aspect of peace and conflict studies was around activism and advocacy. How African countries and Asian countries fought for independence or advocated for independence, and also fought against or towards the post-Cold War relations. And we can go particularly around the book of Arturo Escobar, 1995. So we are saying the post-war or the post-Cold War and post-colonial, and particularly in Africa and Asia, the conflict studies around that time was about activism, about advocacy of the African countries, and how this idea of independence actually sparked violence and sparked conflict. What is then the problem, and what is the puzzle? What is the current situation? What are we teaching, and what are we researching in relation to peace and conflict studies? Can we still insist that peace and conflict studies is not useful? Can we still insist that the study of peace and conflict is about the ideological issues and activism? Are we still within this tradition? What has happened? And looking at the different traditions in peace and conflict studies in the contemporary, we sort of grouped our analysis into here what we are calling North Atlantic universities, which includes USA and UK. And what we realize is that the emphasis around peace and conflict studies is basically conflict studies in the North Atlantic universities. In the Scandinavian universities, there's been a little bit of effort here from Johan Galtung's maximalist agenda to look a little bit more into positive peace as an opposite to negative peace, which again still has a deep a sense of conflict studies, but with some transition towards peace studies, what we are calling here a positive peace. And of course, that also led the Scandinavian universities to touch a little more about the social and economic structures as attributes, as domains to appreciate peace and conflict studies. In South Asia or Southern Asia, the emphasis is still on conflict studies. And so is Africa. The African emphasis, when we are talking about conflict and peace studies, the peace component is still limited or pretty absent. We are still making an emphasis on conflict studies. So let's now come back closer home to Africa and look at African universities in more details. And what we understand and what we see and what we discovered is that there is a huge studies around conflict studies and less around peace studies. And there is a strong sense how we teach and research is more to do with the history of conflicts, not a very practical domain of how to become and sustain and remain peaceful. We are more into history of conflict, talking about northern Uganda, talking about the Lord's Resistance Army, northern Uganda. We are talking about Revolutionary United Front, RUF, in Sierra Leone. We are talking about the conflicts, the Mai Mai group in DR Congo. We are talking about the Janjaweed, the Al-Qaeda, the Boko Haram, and all, in a deeply historical sense. And the trajectory is more history. So, and because of this emphasis on conflict studies, we've developed a strong tradition around conflict analysis tool and not peace analysis tool. And of course, as it were, in this conflict analysis tool, we emphasize the new liberal notion of conflict, the question of resource, the question of bad governance, the question of bad leadership, and on and on and on and on. And of course, talking about conflict sensitivity, how to behave, and how do we minimize in our behavior, attitude, and conduct questions of conflict in what we call conflict analysis. But we do less of a peace sensitivity. As a result, the implication here is we do not know peace. We don't have a substantial understanding about peace. And there is hardly any knowledge of conflict early warnings and conflict prevention as a terrain within the peace studies, but more to do with conflict sensitivities. So conflict early warning would have been more strategic because we begin to see beforehand, we begin to address core issues beforehand in the peace continuum. But because we are more focused on conflict, we first wait for conflict to happen, or it gets us by surprise, and we start theorizing and historicizing that. As a result, majority of the students who go through conflict studies are more in the domain of critique and blame centered. So most of our conflict students and researchers are reactive. And also the discipline has become too politicized in a sense that we do not understand the complex economic, okay, the political domain, but we are more into doing political activism. We are more into political reactivism, and so we become more and more to politicize. And we cease to understand the political contribution, the historical and economic contribution in a substantive way of looking at peace in terms of discourse and practice. So we are saying here that the discipline has become too politicized, but also this may look contradictory, but it's not, because when we politicize in a sense of understanding but not in a sense of activism, it's important. When we historicize in a sense of following the archaeology and the genealogy of the issues for purposes of reinforcing peace and re-engineering and re-engendering peace, then we are saying that politicization, historicization becomes peace strategic or strategically in the domain of peace. So the discipline has become too politicized and yet depoliticized and dehistoricized. But even when we go through the history, it's not with an idea of understanding how to build the peace concept and peace model, but it's simply to explain more and more the conflict, about the violence. So it's a thin line here, but we are saying that the domain of politicizing, historicizing should be more towards peace and less towards conflict. In conclusion, as we said earlier on, we are producing crop of students, experts, researchers that are more enhanced, solid, founded, stronger in conflict analysis, but not in peace analysis and peace practice. Ladies and gentlemen,